For those of you who were around last week, in fact, let's kick this off. Yep, if you've been to some of the previous presentations before, you're probably a little bit familiar with me already. My name's Richard Ronce. I've been with Advantech since 2008. Did a few years in sales, moved up to product sales management, spent a bit of time in business development. In the last few years, I've been the online sales leader for the internal team. My email address is right there at the bottom in case you've got any questions that come up either during the presentation or afterwards. So by all means, feel free to contact me at richard.ronce@advantech.net.au. I also have with me today again from last week our technical manager, Brenton Thompson, and he's actually going to probably be taking the majority of this presentation. But without further ado, what we want to do is we want to get going. So what we are going to cover today with Node-RED for device connectivity is we're going to look at what is Node-RED. We're going to look at where it's used, the installation. We're going to look at the interface in terms of how to use the application software. We're going to look at flow setups, the flow examples. We're going to look at a Modbus case study and also the additional resources that come with the package themselves. So to get right into it, what is Node-RED? To put it into a bit of context, it's a graphical tool to allow you to program hardware devices, APIs, and other online services. So it's also a visual flow-based programming tool for other devices within the IoT framework that currently exist. It does have a very large range of free components that come within repositories that you can make use of. And most importantly, it's the type of software that you can access and edit your applications through any sort of web browser out there. It's based on the open standards MQTT, JSON, JavaScript, etc. So it is quite a powerful package. So when it comes to the visual-based programming for IoT devices, one thing here to be aware of straight away is that it requires minimal to no programming skills that you would initially need before you start looking at this. As this presentation goes on, you will see certain examples of basic scripting involved, and if you do have those skills, it is definitely going to make use of this software a lot better. And that means you're going to be able to go through much deeper and do slightly more complex, more powerful things within. But the first thing that we really want to take note of is that it's really a four-step process. And the first one is all about choosing the components, also called nodes. And they're part of the package that Brenton will explain to you and highlight as this presentation goes on. Once you have selected the nodes, we go to the second stage, which is configuring the nodes with the inbuilt forms. Then we move on to connecting those nodes using mouse or any sort of device that you've got connected to your platform. And then we look to deploy the package. We use the deploy button to run the package themselves. So when it comes to where Node-RED fits in, for you who were here last week, we did look at the ICR3232 and the BBSR308 as our industrial LTE routers and gateways. As you can see there, those gateways can fit into a number of verticals, and then they have not only the application within different industries such as CCTV, energy, transportation, etc., but they've also got the means to send information up to the cloud, through to SCADA platforms, etc. Those devices there can also make use of legacy protocols. And when it comes to the software that we can see on the right, Node-RED is one of those packages. One of the things that I do want to say, particularly for people who've been around a little bit longer or used some Advantech software in the past, there used to be a package called AtomView back in the days of, I think it was Microsoft XP. Windows XP, and that used to be the go-to generic package for small-scale applications doing simple data acquisition and analysis. That package has since gone end of life quite some time ago. especially for Windows 10, it's no longer supported. And as devices have gotten more capable, as they've become more intelligent, Node-RED has become that package to use for small scale applications at the edge to do data processing and manipulation where the data is collected before it goes up to a higher or a more powerful system. So this gives that flexibility at the edge for those smaller scale applications. Once again, we can see here that these are the packages, these are the hardware devices such as the SR308 and the ICR3232, where Node-RED would actually be installed into those devices in order to allow for that capability to take place. What we also have is the Atom 6700 range. Now, this is a new range that's coming out. There's actually going to be a presentation on this next week. So we're not going to go too much into this, but Node-RED is also capable of being used within the Atom 6700 range as intelligent I/O. So we're not going to go too much into that. Most of the examples that we're going to be looking at here are going to be in reference to the LTE gateway. So this presentation does build on from what we talked on last week. And the next thing that we're going to look at is the installation of the software. So what I will do is I will hand over to Brenton and let you carry on.
Thanks, Richard. So as we explained last week with our cellular routers, we have these extra functionalities called user modules, which expand the software functionality of the modules, and Node-RED is one of them. So if you go on the link on the page here at our ep.advantech-bb.cz, that's our engineering portal from the Czech Republic, our Advantech office there, who actually designed and manufacture these routers. There's a plethora of user modules on there, including all the Node-RED ones you see on the right-hand side there. Now, to get started with Node-RED, the first thing we need is Node.js, because that's what Node-RED is built off. Now, for those who are already technically inclined, we're running version 8 of Node.js on these devices. There is a version 10 in the works, and in terms of the versioning for Node-RED, we're using 0.17 with 0.20 coming along the line. There are no plans at this stage to go to Node-RED version 1, simply because we need to test and harden it on our routers first. We don't sort of just keep leapfrogging to the latest version. We want to make sure that the Node-RED that we use and install won't affect the functionality of the routers. And on the screen there, as you can see with some of the dependencies, as I mentioned earlier, Node.js, we have to install that first before we install Node-RED. And an example of some of the other dependencies is the GPS module if we want to use the GPS daemon inside Node-RED. Now, there are a few limitations with Node-RED on our gateways. When it references v3 version only, that's because, as I mentioned in our presentation last week, we have our v2 and v3 platforms. Our v2 is our 3G platform. Node-RED isn't supported on our 3G devices, only our 4G LTE gateways, such as the ICR3232 and the SR308. And the second limitation is that NPM is not installed on these devices simply because A, it's a lot of overhead in disk space and processing, and B, it's a lot of processing power as well. So to copy nodes onto the gateway, we need to put them in a user module format. Now, this is something that can be done by yourself or by Advantech. I'll go into a bit more detail as the presentation goes on. So just a quick look at the user interface of Node-RED. It's sort of split into 4 sections here. On the furthest left side, you have our node palette, and that's where all of our nodes live. So you can scroll up and down and you'll see our input, output, and our function nodes. And on the second page is the flow. So that's where you would wire up all of your nodes from the left-hand side. The third slide, or third part in there, is our node configuration. That's the flow form that Richard mentioned earlier. That's where we actually configure the node, whether it's to set the port numbers, Modbus addresses, whatever we need to do. And on the fourth side is a sidebar. So it gives us information as well as a debug in case you have a debug node and you want to see if your flow is actually working. And just going into detail on the flows, it's split into 3 sections. We've got inputs, processing, and outputs. The input side is pretty self-explanatory. This can be data that's coming into the device, whether it's by serial, TCP, MQTT, or even reading a file off the device. We can read the contents of it and then push it into the second section, which is processing. Now we can use a function, which is a JavaScript function, to manipulate data further. We can use XML to put it into an XML format, JSON, we can even gzip it if you really want to. We can also switch values. For example, if you're expecting a 4 value and you want that to be a 2, we can switch that on the fly. And in terms of our output nodes, that's where we want our manipulated data to come out to. For example, we could send an SMS, or we can send it to an MQTT broker, Modbus TCP, SQL database, even to another file. So there's a few options we can do in terms of inputs, processing, and outputs. And just for our Node-RED on our routers, it's a user module. It's a base system which forces HTTPS. We don't allow HTTP. If you do want HTTP, you'll have to go in and configure it. It's not impossible, but it's not for the average user as well. Some of the more useful nodes we build into it are ping, SNMP, serial, and UI control. And we also have a number of router-specific nodes, such as the digital input and output that's found on the ICR3232 and the SR308, the signal LED, and the SMS sender. And with the extra user modules for additional nodes, we can add GPS, gzip, FTP, Modbus, MQTT, QNX, Splunk, and there's always heaps more that are being developed. So our prepared nodes are in a user module format, as I mentioned earlier, because we don't have NPM. They're optimized for our routers and they're tested by our team thoroughly. You can add your custom nodes and upload it to the router, either directly using SSH or via user module. Just be wary though that it may not be tested and it may not be compatible properly with our routers, so there may be some debugging involved. It's not a perfect science, even I've had trouble with it, but if you have any questions or if you desperately need a node to work on your device, please let us know. We can talk to our Czech Republic team and we can try and get that sorted for you. Now, just a quick look into the user module configuration. So once you install the Node-RED user module, you'll be presented with the screen on the left. So you need to go into the Node-RED configuration. By default, the port it sits on is 1880 and it's not set to automatic start. So once you tick automatic start and apply, it'll restart the Node-RED module. And then you can, on your web browser on the right-hand side, you can go to the gateway IP address, throw in the port on HTTPS, and you'll get to the logon screen. Now, it uses the same credential as what's on the router. So if your username and password on the router is root and root respectively, it's the same in Node-RED. And here's just a very quick flow example of Node-RED. It looks pretty daunting, but it actually, the more you use it, the easier it actually gets. For example, in this flow here, we're taking data from COM11 and we're using a number of JavaScript functions to convert it to a string, converting it to a payload object, and then splitting the data off into different graphs, as you can see on the bottom hand side. So as much as daunting as it looks, it's actually not too bad. And we'll go through this in a later slide just quickly to show you how we did it here locally for a Modbus sensor. But that's just a very rough example of how it all works. What we're taking is raw data from a COM port and displaying it into live values, such as the gauges on the visualization, as well as historical data on the bottom of the graph as well. So as I mentioned earlier, here's a sort of a quick case study as to what we did with Node-RED and using Modbus RTU. So for what I had was a Modbus RTU sensor, and our objective was to get the values from the sensor and put it into a nice human readable format, such as a gauge. So that's exactly what we did here below. And we also added, we wanted the ability to view the values remotely and securely as well. And we'll go into that now. So the proposal was to use the SR308 or the ICR3232 because they both support Modbus R2 via RS485. They both support Node-RED to display and read those register values. And we want to be able to view that data remotely using a web browser via a private APN or OpenVPN. So the first step we need to do was connect the Modbus device via RS485 to our router, install Node-RED, use Node-RED to read the registers, convert the raw data to values. Now that's important, and we'll go into more detail as it goes on. And then we display those values in the dashboards for a quick and easy look. So the first step, as I mentioned, was connecting the Modbus R2 device to the ICR3232. So you can see there I've got an EYC THG03 sensor. It's a CO2 temperature and humidity indoor sensor with a display. It also has RS485 on the back so we can talk to it. So it's just simple 2 wires from the sensor to the gateway. And the second step was to install Node-RED. So as we mentioned before, you need to install Node.js first because that's what it's built off. Then we install the Node-RED module itself, and then there's an extra user module called Node-RED/Modbus. This adds the Modbus TCP and serial nodes to our Node-RED installation. And then we have to go into Node-RED and enable automatic start to turn it on. And then once it starts, it boots up. So once it's done, we go to our gateway address and add port 1880. and using the credentials, as I mentioned earlier, in the device. If it's root and root, that's the same ones that'll be here. So the next step is using Node-RED to read the registers from the Modbus R2 device. So what we'd have to do is use the Modbus serial in node from the flow side on the left, drag it to our flow, and then go into the node configuration by double clicking on it, and we need to specify the Modbus port. So that's by adding a new Modbus serial config. Now we specify the physical port name as /dev/ttys1 for the ICR3232 and the baud rate of 9600, which is from the user manual of my sensor. Step 3 was using Node-RED to read the registers from the Modbus R2 device. Now, what you would do is in the node configuration, you would set the type as a holding register, which we've done here because that's what matches from our manual. And you can see that I start at 561, whereas on the manual side it says at 562. This is because Node-RED starts at 0 and when counting Modbus devices. So as in the red text in the manual there, the base address is at 1 in the manual rather than 0 in ModScan, for example. And Node-RED is the same. So we need to go one address back, otherwise you'll get some funny data and you won't know what you're seeing. So we start at 561, we count one register length and poll it for 60 seconds, no problems there. And then we use Node-RED to read the registers there. So what we do is we connect that node to a debug node, and then you can use the debug node to see if you're actually getting data. Now you can see here that we're getting 2 hex values here, which is what we're expecting. But that's not going to help us because we're getting the data in hex. So we need to convert that data. So how to convert that is to use the JavaScript function node. So what we're doing here is converting it to a string first, defining it as a variable, and then converting hex to decimal. So this code, you don't need to be a JavaScript wizard to learn this sort of stuff. I literally found this by using Dr. Google, and it was pretty straightforward. So all we're doing here is converting it from a hex value to a decimal value, which is what will tie into our dashboard and gauges. So by doing that, we can, using the function node, you can see I get a decimal point here. In this case, it's CO2 levels, so parts per million, so it's 494. And some values, sometimes you need temperature humidity. It may show up as, for example, temperature might show as 232. You need to divide it by 10 to convert it to the actual temperature value. Normally, your sensor would tell you if you need to do this. And how to display these values in a neat fashion. So as you can see, we've got our nodes on the left there, our input nodes from CO2, temperature and humidity. We're putting them towards a function node to convert them to decimal values. And then we use a gauge in the UI part down on the bottom of Node-RED to send it straight to a gauge. So you can see I've got CO2 gauge, a temperature gauge, and a humidity gauge. So for the CO2 gauge, you can see I've set the units as parts per million, and I've set the range from 0 to 1500. And what the color gradient does is that it will automatically divide it across 3. And for the values around towards the 1500 range, it'll be red, yellow in the middle, green at the end. At the other end, sorry. And then we configure the gauge to the Node-RED dashboard. And then at the end of that, you get a nice dashboard here showing your values. So you can see the CO2 levels, temperature in degrees, and relative humidity. And how to access the dashboard is going to the gateway address with port 1880 and adding /UI. That gives you your dashboard. And here you can see some nice, pretty values that are nice and readable format. So in conclusion, we can take data from a Modbus R2 device and display it in a nice, neat dashboard fashion. And this dashboard can be accessed locally via the local IP of the gateway, or if we use a private APN or OpenVPN, we can access them through the IP addresses on a private network, which means it's safe, so no one can get in there and start playing around from a public side of things. We can add extra functions via Node-RED. For example, we can use a binary output or an SMS output. So if the CO2 level gets too high, we can tell it to trigger a siren via digital output, or we can send an SMS to the floor manager who can say, hey, it's getting dangerous in here, you need to evacuate everybody. So this is just a little example of what we can do with Node-RED, but this is just honestly scratching the surface. For those that are Node-RED inclined, you would know that there's so much more we could do with this platform, but here we're just showing you a brief example of what can be done. And some of the sources for this information, as I mentioned earlier, so our engineering portal on the first link, which is ep.advantech-bb.cz, that's got all of the user module information as well as router gateway information. You don't need to write these links down, as this slide should be provided by our marketing team in the coming few days.
Yep, that's right.
There's also a note from our team on how to build your own custom nodes. As I mentioned earlier, it's not an easy process and it's not always foolproof, but it can be done. As I mentioned, if you do require a custom node and it's desperate for your project, please get in touch with us. We may be able to help you out. We may have already done it before. Yeah, so that's that. Get in touch with us if that's the case. The Node-RED nodes repository is where we lift all our nodes from. So if you need a particular node, you can browse it on flows.nodered.org, and if it's there, we can try and transplant it to the router. And on the last section, there is videos about Node-RED. There's a couple of YouTube links on how to get started and how to use Node-RED. Node-RED is actually public software, so Advantech doesn't really offer training per se as such on it. It's more of something that you can learn yourselves, which we've had to do the same way. You can install it on Linux and Windows yourselves. So if you want to have a crack at it outside of the router environment, you can. You can copy nodes and flows from your development environment to the router gateway as well, assuming you have the same nodes, and they'll work perfectly. But as always, if you do need some advice on Node-RED, or you have an application where you think Node-RED might be suitable, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us, and we may be able to help.
It's definitely a pretty powerful.
Absolutely, Richard. Yeah.
Yep. So I think, just to summarize, one of the things that we've really sort of gone into here is, I would say, quite an in-depth introduction into Node-RED in terms of what it is, how it can be used. I think, with all of the information that we've put forward, especially with the case study, I think Brenton's really spot on when he says this is really just scratching the surface. At a high level, fundamentally, the four-step process, I think, is relatively simple.
Yeah.
It's probably a bit easier to get your head around. It's once you start going into depth, because like any software package, like a lot of software packages, this is not something which you install, get it up and running, and then expect it to do something. This is basically, it's a development environment. So how far you can go with it is up to you and up to your needs, up to your imagination. It's really just a case of how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. So just to sort of really tie things up, really to close things off, more than anything, as we can see there, especially on the right-hand side, it is a visual programming tool. It's, I think, an easy way to map information flows, figure out where you're going to be processing it, how you're going to be displaying it, in order not only to collect your information, but also to visualize on it and report on it. There is that components repository, which we've got the link to, and once again, that will be as part of the downloadable content, hopefully, that we'll make available to you later. And as Brenton said, it's available. You can get access to it through any web browser. I know that I've definitely learned a lot about it, especially in terms of some of the links and some of the intricacies on how to access the user interface and how to get through to the programming and the deployment side of things. But once again, it is built on the standards. So especially if you know those languages, know those structures, especially with JavaScripting, it's definitely allows you to go as far as your imagination would take you. But at the same time, it's really not built for that core process, whereas something like a SCADA package would live. So that basically takes care of that presentation for today.